James Fodor, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
The theme of today's episode is why am I not a Christian? I am, but you're not. So before actually tackling that humongous topic, I will break with my normal form and actually just ask you a more personal question, which is, what is your history? Where do you come from when getting at these kind of questions? It seems to just be more fitting. This feels like a more personal, existential conversation. So what's
Sure.
your religio-philosophic history?
Well, I was raised as a Mormon so I live in Australia and there are Mormons down there. So I was raised in a Mormon family for the first 20 or so years of my life. So I know not everyone considers them to be, but I think of Mormons as Christians. So I thought of myself as a Christian and went to church every Sunday and all that stuff. And when I was around 20 years old, I started to doubt my faith and read a bunch of stuff and went through a bit of a difficult period of sort of adjusting. And I came out of that as a non-believer. Since then, I've interacted with and discussed with lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, faith backgrounds, and belief systems, and tried to see if there was any of them that I found convincing or appealing, but I sort of have not done so in the 15 years since then. So yeah, I call myself an atheist, and I have been for some time, but still open to dialogue and discussion whenever I have the opportunity.
Who were the main people, authors, philosophers, or otherwise, that you found most influential during that period of doubt? I'm just curious.
Well, a lot of the material that I was looking at was specific to Mormonism, so it was various websites that discussed the history of Mormonism and the aspects of the historicity, like of the Book of Mormon and things like that. More general philosophical discussion. Probably I was exposed to a little bit around that time, and also somewhat later. So people like, I think, Bertrand Russell has been influential. David Hume as well, probably my favorite philosopher, and also sort of a organized skepticism, scientific skepticism. So people like James Randi and Carl Sagan I found influential as well.
It's funny. It's very cool for me to be talking to you because back in the day, in my own formative period when I started to think about topics related to philosophy of religion, I grew up quite conservative. And so though I still identify as a Christian, it's a much different kind than the one in the tradition in which I grew up. I remember stumbling upon your book, Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. And that's so significant because William Lane Craig was like the formative influence upon my thinking and certainly early life anyway. And I remember seeing that book and it struck fear into my heart because I thought, oh, if I ever read this book, it would just dismantle my beliefs. And I mean, it just goes to show I've come a long way because when I went off to Oxford to get my master's degree in philosophy of religion, I read through Graham Oppy's Arguing About Gods, which was his case against belief in God. And it's not that I think that your arguments wouldn't convince me that there is no case for Christianity, but I've just come to realize that like there's no simplistic proof one way or the other. Like if there is a rational demonstration of the truth or falsity of these beliefs, it's going to be very, very complex. So there's always one more book to read, an article to digest.
Yeah, absolutely.
But nevertheless, it still is really cool to be talking to you because I've been at least aware of you for a long time.
So that's cool. Well, nice to be here.
Yeah, of course. So I think a good structure for the discussion stems from a particular blog post of yours where you delineate the case for and against Christianity, I think quite clearly. On the one hand, you consider 4 groups of arguments for Christianity and then 3 arguments against. And so I think it would make sense to just go through those as far as we can in our time constraints and see how far we go. The first concerns philosophical arguments for God's existence. So you state pretty clearly you don't find these convincing. And I'm curious as to the succinct statement of why that is. Do you think there's kind of a general failing behind these distinct arguments or some
philosophical arguments for God's existence?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that there are two broad classes of reasons why I don't find these sorts of arguments convincing. One is that they have to make a number of assumptions in order to get going. Like, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument has to make many assumptions about the nature of causation and time and the nature of the universe and things like that, the nature of physics. And different arguments obviously have to make different assumptions. And I think that um, it's usually more than I think most of these assumptions are about things that we can't really know anyway. And so when taken together, I often find that the arguments are just appealing to fairly small probabilities that all of the assumptions would hold. And I think that the correct response for these sorts of things is usually to withhold judgment. Um, and so the other, I mean, it's sort of related to the first, but the other broad concern I have with philosophical arguments for God's existence is that many of them, I think, are susceptible to the what I call or what has been called the problem of divine psychology, which is the idea that they require some sort of inference or knowledge about God's desires or motivations or reasons for acting one way or another, which I think it's not very plausible to um, know about antecedent to any particular like theology that you adopt. But if you're reasoning about God's existence, you probably shouldn't be already committed to a theology, it seems to me. So I think absent that, it's often, given the nature of God and his lack of constraints, it's, I think, very difficult to say much of anything about what he or she would or would not do. Which means that the arguments, I think, most of them are sort of pretty poorly grounded.
Mm. Well, I have sympathies for both of those considerations. With respect to the first point, I do wonder, though, that as a general consideration, that seems to apply to any significant philosophical viewpoint or question. Like they're always going to involve certain assumptions that'll prove controversial. So I wonder if that kind of issue would just generalize to philosophy as a whole. And maybe you see that implication and go, right, exactly. Like in any philosophical dispute, theistic or otherwise, we should withhold judgment. And I actually have some sympathy for that position. I mean, I'm just above agnostic on the best of days. So, but I wonder what do you think there's a something specifically detrimental in the case of theistic arguments, or is this just kind of inherited from the ambiguities and assumptions that attend philosophy as a whole?
I don't think it's unique to philosophy of religion. I think it just depends on the argument in question as to what how many different assumptions it appeals to. So the Kalam cosmological argument is one I've written a fair bit about, and I do think it has quite a large number of assumptions that it needs to make in order to work, compared to some philosophical arguments. But any philosophical argument does have some assumptions, and I think that often it is appropriate to remain. Not necessarily agnostic, but at least to not hold views very strongly, especially in the presence of a lot of disagreement among philosophers about issues. And that's an area where I think that theistic, maybe not in the case of yourself, but for many theists, hold to their beliefs very strongly, in despite of this large amount of disagreement. So um, I think that, yeah, it's not unique to arguments for God, but I think that the disconnect between the conviction is and the tenuous nature of the argument is particularly strong there. But I would also then combine that um, with other more specific concerns about like the issue of divine psychology, and then with respect to any particular religious tradition, then there's concerns about the nature of that tradition itself. So it depends exactly what position we're talking about. Like if you weaken the claim to like any sort of god, um, I would say the arguments for that are not very good, but I've argued elsewhere that the probability of like any sort of theism is maybe like 10% epistemic probability. Whereas if you're talking about more specific religious traditions, then from my perspective, the probability goes way down because then there are more claims that one has to defend. So, um, yeah, the uncertainty issue is there throughout, but it depends on exactly the claim being made.
Yeah, so I like that third consideration that you've alluded to there, the probability of theism being 10%. So I do want to talk about that, but I can't help but zero in on the second consideration for a bit more focus, the divine psychology issues that arise in formulating these various theistic arguments. You may not know this, but you're talking to the fellow that wrote the paper, Divine Psychology and Cosmic Fine Tuning. So
Oh wow, I
I've
didn't know that.
thought, yeah, I know. So I've thought very long and hard about divine psychology, and I do think it's a serious concern. What I suggest in the paper, anyway, is that insofar as our theistic hypothesis is the omni-God, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, which is usually what people mean, and we can debate the merits of that. But if we take that on as the hypothesis, several philosophers have argued that we can then ground claims about divine psychology in considerations of moral value. And so the more morally value some state of affairs is, the more likely it is that God will actualize it, whatever the context might be. And so then you would want to show in the context of the relevant theistic argument, take fine tuning, that a universe fine tuned for life is a great good and it allows for moral goods, and therefore it's not terribly unlikely that God would actualize it. And so that obviously rough and ready connection is between God's moral perfection and taking these various good actions. What do you think of that maneuver?
Yeah, well, that's the standard approach I'm familiar with. I'll have to have a read of your article. I just looked it up here. It was published last year, I
Yeah,
see. So looking forward
yeah.
to that.
It's a
Yeah.
tour de force.
So yes, in terms of grounding God's desire or reasons to create in moral reasons. Well, I think that it raises a number of issues. So one, then the problem with any of these things, it depends on what version of God is being defended. So I have an issue with the idea that there can be any moral reasons for God to do anything if God is conceptualized as the greatest possible or greatest conceivable being, because it seems to me inconsistent with the notion that he's the greatest conceivable or greatest possible being, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there being states of affairs that he can actualize that are in some way morally better than God by himself, God or than God alone. Um, I know there are some people who don't see an issue there, but to me, that just doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense. And I think you have to make various arguments around as to how you can, yeah, you have to find a way to reconcile those two. And I find that a little difficult. But you can weaken the conception of God that you're arguing for as to not necessarily say that it's the greatest conceivable being. And then weakening there, I would suggest that there's then a further question about exactly how we understand the nature of moral goodness. And what types of states of affairs we'd expect God to actualize. And one of my main concerns, particularly about the fine tuning argument, is that it's not at all clear that the sort of universe we would expect God to actualize it looks anything like ours. Um, and again, that depends on exactly what you take the basis of moral goodness to be, whether it's like consciousness or pleasure or preference satisfaction, or it's like some combination of complex things interacting or whatever. You predict sort of different universes, and different people I've spoken to will sort of say different things about this. One of the things is that it seems to potentially lead to prediction that God creates a multitude of universes that exemplify different types of goods. And this then raises the concern that there's a sort of from my point of view, and I still need to think about this a bit more, but this raises a concern that there's sort of a fine-tuning argument in reverse, that of all of the types of universes that God has created with conscious life in them, it seems that many of them, indeed, I would argue the vast majority of them, do not look anything like our universe, like they consist of disembodied forms of life or that sort of thing. So I think it's hard to discuss in the abstract, because it really comes down to what is exactly being claimed about the nature of morality and the nature of God's reasons with respect to morality. But ultimately, I find that often these claims are it. Well, at least again, I'm still exploring this, but I've not been very convinced about the ability to provide a combination of these views that seems to render making our universe and only our universe, or a universe like ours, to be fairly probable. It seems to me that it always gets swamped by other creative possibilities that don't look like our universe.
Mm. So that first consideration about God as a maximally great being, I think that argument bears resemblance to one that Neil Manson has made as well, and he would be the foremost proponent of the psychology objection in the context of fine tuning, where the idea is like, if God is the most valuable possible being, then how could any additions to a world plus God alone be more valuable than what already obtained? But I don't know. I mean, I think that we have means for comparing the value of two different infinite magnitudes. Because let's say that roughly God's value is infinite. I think we can still say that we've added to the value of a world by adding finite goods. And then I don't think that that would necessarily compromise God's status as the greatest conceivable being, because even in a world where you have God plus, say, the finite goods of created beings and what they can do and relationships they have, God would still be greatest among them. So it's not
That
obvious
just
to me
seems to
what
me to
the
be an
contradiction is supposed to be.
equivocation. That seems to be an
Mm,
equivocation to me, because if we're to say that God, if we're to cash out God as the greatest conceivable being as simply having infinite value, well, that's not actually the same claim, because as you've just stated, infinities can still be compared in terms of value. So
okay,
it
right.
seems to me that then we're just saying God has infinite value, but there may be greater infinities with greater value. And like, if that's how you want to cash out the notion of um, the greatest conceivable being, then fine. I think that objection wouldn't go through. But to me, that's not really what greatest means.
Well, what is okay? So what does it mean?
Well, I don't think that there is such a thing as the greatest conceivable being if you're going to conceive of it in a quantitative sense, because like there's no
Hmm.
highest number. Um, so I think that the notion is incoherent. Seems to me I could just always think of something better by just adding more good
Okay.
stuff on.
Okay. Well, then, yeah. Okay, that would be I think, a more formidable objection, and
Well, yeah,
one that
right.
isn't is like it's incoherent to just say that there's a greatest conceivable being. Um, and I
Depends what you can conceive of course. So it's one of my other
sure.
issues with the notion of conceivability, but maybe put that aside.
I mean, I have sympathy with that objection. How do you? Because you can't just say God's value is infinite. I agree, because there are different transfinite cardinals
Mm.
of greater and greater magnitude, and there is no greatest transfinite cardinal. And so I don't know. I mean, I are there non-quantitative ways of grounding God's status as
Well,
greatest
that's what
that you
I've heard, that
are
the
aware of?
notion of God being like the notion. Well, this is what Craig says. That like the God is a
Oh yeah,
qualitative infinite, and I don't really know what that means, but at least it seems to
I
get
don't
around
either.
this idea of just sort of adding more onto it, which is why I don't say that the notion of the greatest conceivable being is necessarily incoherent. I say it depends on how you want to articulate it. I think if articulated in a sort of a quantitative sense, um, I can't really make sense of that. But then it does raise a question about whether all types of goods are comparable, like morally comparable
Mm,
to each other. Because if there are types of goods that aren't morally comparable, then we might not be able to say that it's better to have a universe with God than like one with God and other stuff, because they may just be incomparable goods. Maybe that's a way you can get around this. But then obviously that raises further questions about whether you believe that there can be incomparable goods or something like that.
mm. I mean, I think those are important questions. Assuming, though, that the concept of a greatest conceivable being is coherent,
Mm.
then I still think we can. Then, in that case, it still makes sense to me to say that God is the greatest conceivable being, but that doesn't entail that a world of God alone is more valuable than any other world. It would just be to say that in whatever worlds in which God exists, or in all worlds in which God exists, which is all of them, God is the most valuable being in that world. But it may still be the case that the entire world is more valuable than a world of God alone. I don't know that
Yes, well,
we would
that's
have to
sort of the
affirm this strong claim. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, well, that's a line of defense I've heard before, and to me that then is going to come down to what exactly counts as a being, and uh,
Mm,
I'm pretty
right.
skeptical about the metaphysics of making those sorts of distinctions. But yeah, if you can have an account about like greatness and an account of being, then maybe there's a way around that. But this is
Yeah.
what I mean when I said before that these sort of arguments often require a lot of assumptions, because um, it's unlikely that I'm going to get on board with the same set of assumptions about like what counts as a being, and what counts as like great as possible to even get to
Mm.
the point of defining what we're talking about. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but like that's just an example of what I was referring to.
So that's fair. But then what about it occurs to me, let's just drop the talk of greatest conceivable and just refer to the omni-God hypothesis, all
Yeah,
powerful, all knowing, and perfectly good.
sure.
Would you say in that case we can start to come to grips with divine psychology?
Well, in order to do that, we need an antecedent theory of what is good. Um,
Mm,
and maybe we sort of think we have enough of that to make some predictions. It's much less clear to me because it seems well, and again, this is going to relate to other assumptions. So the way I understand goodness is in a naturalistic way, and it relates to the nature of sort of humanity, or maybe uh, s- conscious beings more specifically. But how we would, it seems like the way that I think about morality is going to be very different to the way a theist probably thinks about morality. Maybe not, but like in a lot of cases, it will. And so, for example, there are theists who say that God doesn't have any moral obligations towards his creation at all. He can do whatever he wants. And those sorts of views, I think, like strong sort of theological voluntarist views, are going to have a hard time making sense of this idea that God creates to like make things, like to create value or something like that. Now, of course, you don't have to adopt those, but I'm just emphasizing that like how we understand goodness is going to affect what we would predict God to do there. But so from my point of view, goodness is going to grant out something like, in terms of well-being of sentient creatures. And the issue there is that it seems like if we agree with something like that, God has a vast array of possible universes that he can create that exemplify that value. And where you go from there depends on whether you assume God creates one universe or many universes. But the endpoint, I think, is the same, that our universe just doesn't look like the vast majority of other possibilities. In particular, the idea that we have life that exists, that essentially well-being exists only as a kind of a sort of look for an emergent property of the interactions of like fundamental particles that obey physical laws. That's a very specific setup for creation, and there seems to be no obvious reason why God would go with that. I know people have given reasons, but I don't find them very convincing. And given that presumably the set of forms of life that God could create that is not so embodied is vastly greater because it's less constrained. Sort of anything coherent that you can imagine, God could actualize that form of life. So I've talked about ideas of like, telepathic forms of life, for example, or ones where we have vastly greater or vastly less moral ability to like affect other people's well-being, or things like this that wouldn't be actualizable in any physical state of affairs, or at least any that we can conceive of. So the main point is that if we make that assumption about well-being being the ground of morality, then what we'd expect is God to actualize a universe that kind of exemplifies maximal well-being, and ours just doesn't seem to look like that to me.
So I think this is a difficult objection to address. It's a strong point. But what I have suggested in that same paper is that much of those possibilities can be narrowed by adding things into the background information against which we compare theism and naturalism. And so if we include in the background enough information, then the moral value of conscious agents will lead us to think we should expect a fine-tuned universe given, or that it's not terribly unlikely that we would observe a fine-tuned
What sort of
universe
things do you
given
have in
these.
mind of adding to the background?
Well, specifically two, I try to justify. That would be the laws of nature, the mathematical form of the laws of nature. And so we say that given universes governed by these laws, which should we expect to see if theism is true? And then I also suggest, in responding to Sinha Babu's article, Electrons in Love, that we should take the psychophysical laws, the laws determining what kind of physical states support mental states, in the background as well. So, for instance, a very rough and ready psychophysical law in our universe is that consciousness requires the physical structure akin to a brain, that two rocks on the seashore couldn't be conscious or have fully developed conscious lives. Two electrons cannot be conscious. These are the psychophysical laws that govern the connection between mental and physical states. And so I say, well, let's just take on the psychophysical laws as background. And so if we include both of those, the laws of nature, the universe, we zero in on those universes governed by our laws of nature and those that have our psychophysical laws, then we ought to expect a fine-tuned universe if theism is true. And it is unlikely if naturalism
Yeah,
is true.
I agree. I just think that that's an awfully gerrymandered set of things where we're taking as given. We're taking as given the set of laws and psychophysical laws, but not the constants. And to me, I just don't really understand what the point of that is.
Because
I raised
we
this
want to
objection
know
with Robin Collins as well, and I don't know that he. Well, yeah, I didn't find very satisfying.
I don't know what he said, but we do that because we want to know the evidential significance of fine-tuning vis-a-vis naturalism and theism. And I think it's perfectly okay.
Oh, it's just that that's a reasonable point to make, but the probabilities that you're talking about, given the psychophysical laws and the laws of physics, don't tell us that. What they tell us is that they tell us the eventual significance of fine-tuning, conditioning on a certain set of information.
Yes.
Which is not our actual set of information.
Well, I think it is our actual set of information. It just depends on how you carve it up, right? What do you include in the background and
Well,
what do
yeah,
you include
that's
as the
exactly what
evidence
I'm
to be
saying.
explained?
It's gerrymandered because we know what the constants are. What we're doing is we're imagining
Mhm.
we don't know what the constants are, but we do know the laws of nature, and we sort of take those as given with respect to God's
Yeah.
creative possibilities. Likewise, the psychophysical laws. To me, that's extremely arbitrary to do that.
Well, so I don't think it makes any difference in the end whether you include all of it as evidence or you include some as background and then the constants as evidence, because insofar as we're zeroing in on naturalism and theism, and this is a point I explicitly make in the paper, and maybe you can argue with it, but if the relevant features are equally likely or unlikely given naturalism and theism, then they're immaterial to evaluating the two hypotheses, naturalism and theism. And so I think because the precise psychophysical laws we have and the laws of nature are equally likely or unlikely given naturalism and theism, if you can include them in the background for that reason because they're immaterial to evaluating the two of them, or you can just consider them as further pieces of evidence. But then when you expand out the odds form of Bayes' theorem, they'll just cancel out because they are equally
Right.
likely or unlikely given the two hypotheses.
Well, to
So I
me,
think
that's just
that's why
obviously
you
wrong.
could carve.
It's obviously wrong that
Okay.
they're equally likely under both, because naturalism predicts that any, well, at least the form of naturalism that I'm understanding here, a reductive form where all forms of well-being are contingent on particular configurations of like physical matter operating in accordance with the laws of physics, right? That naturalism predicts that only those possibilities, that those are the only possibilities, the only ways of achieving well-being in the universe. Whereas theism, it seems, accepts a vast array of other possibilities that aren't so grounded. And so, if you look at all of the ways, imagine all the ways that you could get well being in the two hypotheses, like naturalism, well, it's only those physically grounded ones. Whereas under theism, it's all of those physically grounded ones plus everything that's not physically grounded or that has some weird combinations or whatever. Um, and to me, that's just obviously vastly greater.
Well, I think that my point about those two laws the two groups of laws we take as background doesn't entirely match up naturalism and theism. You're right. But once you've grounded the psychophysical laws in particular, which dictate the connection between physical states and mental states, it will at least show or narrow down to universes where if God creates physical life, it will have to be uh, ones in which we have these psychophysical laws because that's fixed in the background. So then you would just be comparing a physical universe with life like this, to ones that are completely non-physical, where life is just consciousness, unembodied minds. And then it's not obvious to me that that's a huge array. You just
Really?
have unembodied minds. And so I don't know
Oh, I
what
think that's a
the
big mistake.
relevant.
I need to write more about this because I don't think it's
Mm,
been explored much. Actually, you might know a bit more about
yeah.
this, but I think that there's this idea that there's a huge range of possible like physical ways of instantiating life, but a small range of instantiating non-physical life. I think it's the exact
Mhm.
opposite because I think that any morally significant property that you can vary about the way life exists or interacts, that's logically possible, God can instantiate that. And so I think you get a similar fine-tuning argument happening just with morally significant um, properties of life. But I haven't written that up rigorously yet because I'm still thinking about
Okay.
it. But I think that this is the basic idea. I think that it's basically too little effort's gone into thinking about what non-physical life looks like and imagining that it's just
Mm,
some sort of monad, like just one or a small number of possibilities. But I don't agree with this. Um,
okay.
but yeah, you might not have too much to say to that because I acknowledge that that's a bit of a maybe a bit novel. Um,
I think it's worth developing. I think that needs to be where the argument goes. And I acknowledge there hasn't been much work from others as far as I'm aware, and certainly not from myself in thinking about what
hmm,
kinds of things non-physical life could allow for and what it would look like. But in the effort to not get too lost on one topic, although I think
sure.
it's fascinating, let me
Sorry,
press
there
forward.
was one other point that I wanted to make,
Yeah,
which feel free to
sure,
respond
sure.
to, is that different people will differ about what the psychophysical laws are.
Mm,
But I mean, my opinion about the relationship of the psychological to the physical is that the psychological um, is dependent on the physical, and so
mm.
like I don't think that non-physical forms of consciousness are even possible. So I think that like the notion of fixing psychophysical laws is not a sort of a trivial exercise to do because from my point of view, that makes God impossible. Like I don't think a non-physical
Right.
intelligence is impossible. So, but obviously
Right.
that's
So
a bit problematic for respect to the argument because it's supposed to establish that. Maybe
yeah,
there's a
I mean, I think
constrained
the
version of
theist
the.
would the
Sorry, go ahead.
theist would have to affirm a more qualified version of the
Yeah.
psychophysical laws in any case, at least with respect to the more unrestricted forms. Then how you go about that is complex. So the
Sorry, just
second
wanted
group
to
of
footnote that.
yeah, yeah. No, I think you're quite right to note that. So we've went at the fine tuning argument, which I'm happy about. I'm pleased about. That's my specific area of
Oh,
research.
thanks for sharing your paper. I hadn't come across that, so I look forward to reading it.
Oh yeah, I'll share my research and papers with anybody who wants to see them. But if you have time, check it out. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. So the second group of arguments are those based on the Bible. We're not going to have very much disagreement here, but the basic considerations you allude to in that group of arguments is the beauty and grandeur of the biblical text as somehow being an argument for the divine
Mm.
inspiration of the Bible and therefore of Christianity. So, I mean, what do you make of those arguments?
I don't think those arguments say much about the biblical inspiration of the text.
Mm,
I think that it says something about the cultural significance and literary significance of the text, which, um, I don't think too many people would disagree with. Obviously, the Bible is a fairly central document to modern Western civilization, and likewise, other religious texts are to different cultures. But I think that this sort of argument is quite familiar as a Mormon because this is one of the main arguments that Mormons use for the divine inspiration of the Book of Mormon. Muslims also use a similar argument for the Quran, which is that like no person could have written this without divine inspiration because of how amazing it is and beautiful and intricate and all that sort of stuff. I think that the simplest objection to this is simply to ask what the baseline is for making this assessment. So, on the one hand, what we would need is some kind of criteria or collection of texts that we can establish as this is what humans can write without divine inspiration. And then we'd have to assess the alleged examples against those criteria and see that somehow they substantially exceed it. And needless to say, I don't know how you could do that because what would be the example, the uncontested example of a non-divinely inspired text? It seems that the proponent of any religious text could simply argue that any other text, oh well, maybe God inspired that too, like because he likes to promote beauty or whatever, and also the criteria in question are just always going to be determined after the fact. So I think that these I think in principle it's an interesting argument because you could imagine a universe in which God did communicate his existence via like the production of certain literature, which is otherwise inexplicable. But it seems sort of hard to know how you would determine that, and it's just not at all obvious that that the religious literature that people claim is that dramatically different in terms of its qualities from apparently non-inspired literature. And also people disagree about, like, I don't speak Arabic, for example, so I can't speak to the literary merits of the Quran, but like it's not like there's a lot of agreement about the exact literary merits of different books either. So I find these arguments just very slippery.
I agree. I don't think they're good arguments at all. And the reason being is what you've alluded to already, that I remember in middle school and high school, I had lots of Mormon friends because there are lots of Mormons where I grew up. And
Oh, where'd you grow up, if I may ask?
I grew up in New Mexico. And
Oh,
so
yeah, there's
we
quite a
just,
few there.
yeah, I'm like, maybe it's the typical amount, but I interacted with them quite a bit. And there was one point when one of them challenged me to read the Book of Mormon
Mm.
because I think it's the Book of Mormon that has the claim within it that if you read this book with an open heart and open
Yeah,
mind,
that's right.
God will convict you of its truth. That's a rough paraphrase, but that was the idea. And so when I hear Christians making the same claim about the Bible, and then a similar claim in the Quran that if you compare any of the surahs or the chapters to any other claimed divinely inspired text, you'll see that the Quranic text is more beautiful. I don't think we see it. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that at all. And I also never got a burning in the bosom when reading the Book of Mormon. And so it's hard to then think of any sort of rational way of saying, but no, the Bible has that. This one does. I don't know that many people find that to be the case.
Well, yeah. So the idea that the burning in the bosom, I think, is a little different from the literary merits of the Book of Mormon. The burning in the bosom is supposed to be a spiritual revelation, personal revelation about the truth of the Book of Mormon, which can happen, I think, irrespective of whether you appreciate its literary merits. Um, but but Christians argue that about mainstream Christianity as well. William Lane Craig is again an obvious proponent of this sort of argument, and it's interesting that his response to this, the fact that different religions make similar claims, is just to say that the fact that there can be inauthentic and false like beliefs in having a divine inspiration doesn't mean that there can't be real ones which are authentic, which I suppose is technically true, but it doesn't seem to answer the epistemological question of how you distinguish these. And I'm not sure he actually is interested in answering that question. But that's one of the things that I struggled with a lot, actually, exploring both Mormonism and then other forms of Christianity, is just that the proponents make strong claims about the desire of God to like reach out to you or reveal Himself spiritually, but don't really have much to say about how you can distinguish this from wishful thinking or from social pressure or from like whatever else you're being influenced by, which I struggled a lot with.
Yes, I think that's something that any reflective person would struggle with. And I do too. I mean, there's one response that I wrote down I wanted to get your opinion of, which, because now we're in the third category of, I think the third category of reasons you consider, which is subjective or experiential reasons for Christian belief. And essentially, the issue is that there are parallel claims you could make about most religious believers of any tradition, that they will claim they have direct encounter with the relevant divine reality, to put the point roughly. Well, one of William Lane Craig's more direct points that he considers is that the witness of the Holy Spirit, so Christian experience specifically, is self-authenticating, and that no other experience is going to be self-authenticating in the same way. So that there is a qualitative distinction between them. And if he's right, I mean, this is the thing, it's a conditional claim. If he's right, well, that would establish the epistemic difference between them and break the parallel. And so it would be epistemologically relevant, I take it. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I don't know. I find these sorts of objections a little bit frustrating because it seems to me just an appeal to fiat. Well, there is a difference, but you can't actually say what the difference is or how you can distinguish it. So I don't know that that really gets us anywhere. I mean, epistemology is difficult. Like, it depends on what you want to regard as an appropriate stopping point, or whether like your justifications have to be justified and so forth. So I think, yeah, under some frameworks, I think it can maybe answer the first order question, but it feels like it doesn't really get to the point of how you can reliably distinguish the two. Particularly because if the idea is that you can only tell, if you can only tell what it's like after you've experienced it, then, I mean, which I think actually is what he says, right? So if you haven't experienced it, then you won't be able to know. But if you have, well, then you will, but you will never be able to explain it to anyone. That doesn't seem to be that useful to me. I don't know. Again, without getting into a whole detour about like what you think is appropriate justification epistemologically, I just find that a frustrating response, because it's sort of like, in some ways it's immune to criticism, but also it's not helpful for anyone who's not already the right kind of Christian. So it feels like it's just a bit of a bit of an academic move.
That might be right. Well, I mean, what do you think about the more general claim, moving past Christianity specifically, that belief in God can be properly basic? I mean, Alvin Planting is a smart guy, and so Reformed epistemology isn't obviously ludicrous, which is this claim that, like, in the same way that I am justified in believing in an external world, and for believing that I'm not dreaming right now, that I'm not trapped in the matrix, I can be justified in believing in God. And it would seem that the common element is that I just directly experience these relevant realities and have no reason to doubt the veridicality or correctness of my experiences. And for that reason, I'm justified in believing in God. I mean, if you asked me, like, why do you believe in God? The fundamental reason, really much of the reason, would not be the arguments that I could produce, but it would simply be that I hate to sound like William Lane Craig, but God has been a reality in my life for as long as I can remember, in some kind of sense. And it just is enough for me. And I recognize frustrating aspect of that for someone who doesn't share the experience. But what do you think about the general project of? But I guess my point was, it seems reasonable to me as I reflect on it, as I reflect on whatever it is that experience consists of, and it seems to cohere most closely with Reformed epistemology. I mean, do you think that the general belief in God can be properly basic in this way?
I don't know that I believe in properly basic beliefs. I have a different epistemological framework to Plantinga, but yeah, and this is why I was saying it sort of depends on how you want to. A big long discussion about how you think epistemology works, because yeah, I don't really want to get into all the details of that because I feel like it could be a bit of a distraction. But I think you do have to make some assumptions about how things work epistemologically, and I will say that it depends on whether this goes. Let me rephrase that. How you evaluate like the properly basic argument depends on how strong the proper basicality is supposed to be, because if it's just sort of if it's supposed to refer to some sort of, I don't know, baseline justification absent like being reflective about it or being exposed to differing views or something like that, then I think that that's more reasonable than the idea that it can justify belief even in the presence of like significant doubt and considerations against, or just reflecting more deeply on like, but how can I know this kind of thing? Because obviously if we're judging, this is one of the reasons I have trouble with justification as a concept, because it's often it's often conceived as being relative to the agent's epistemic state, and you can kind of have arbitrary epistemic states, right? Like you can have agents with very weird ideas that they've been exposed to, or sets of beliefs that they've started with, and so in some of those conditions, maybe you could think of belief in God as being justified as properly basic, but I'm a bit more interested in whether we can justify God or justify theism, given the context, like the discursive context that we're operating in, which is, cognizant of all of the various reasons to doubt and concerns. And from there, I think that the notion of proper basicality just doesn't do very much work for me. I think of epistemology in a bit more of a holistic sense, like a coherentist sort of approach. So I think about beliefs as needing to do explanatory work in helping us to make sense of the world. And I'm not saying that you can't appeal to theistic considerations in virtue of that, but I think proper basicality just isn't formulated in that sort of way. It's sort of antecedent to all of that, and that's just not how I think about justification, at least in the context of like reflective disagreement, because like there's levels of justification, right? So maybe there's because I don't necessarily want to say that, the medieval peasant who's heard nothing different and had no opportunity to think about anything, like, are they justified in believing in God? Like, I think that in a sense they probably are, right? But I don't think that they're justified in the same way as someone who's like critically thought about an issue and been able to consider and debate different ideas. So I think that there's the notion of justification is a bit slippery because of its relative to agent context, and I don't think that the notion of proper basicality is strong enough, or at least I'm not convinced that it is, to do much work in a discursive context where there is exposure to these different ideas and considerations.
Interesting. I think I would, in those terms, consider myself the reflective peasant, but one that has concluded. I would say I probably have that same epistemological or epistemic position as the peasant, except that while I have considered the arguments in detail, I'm just agnostic about so many of them for precisely the reasons that you outlined in considering theistic arguments, that these are so complex and the arguments for and against proliferate in fractal-like complexity that I'm just agnostic 99% of the time. And so I retain my initial justification for belief in God, wherever that source might be that justifies myself and the medieval peasant.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I think about things a bit differently there. I think that I think that uncertainty is a reason to doubt, not a reason to hold to some pre-existing belief. Like, I think if you don't understand or know about those uncertainties, then maybe you can justify a belief as properly basic or something like that. But I think that the appropriate response to those sort of uncertainties and doubts is to like lower your confidence in that belief.
Mm, fair play.
Not just
The
theistic beliefs, by the way, but
in general,
yeah.
yeah. The fourth category would be the historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus, the
Yeah.
claim that we have sufficient empirical evidence, historical evidence, to conclude that Jesus literally rose from the dead. Now, I think most of us would agree if we did have strong historical evidence for that event, we would have a pretty good case for Christianity. I know there are some people that would conclude, even if we have that evidence, we should conclude that it was aliens that raised Jesus from the dead. Yeah, we could talk about that. But I'm curious. In my preparation for this, I didn't actually look into your proposed explanation for the relevant evidence, but I'm curious what that is, what this model is that you've put together. That essentially it draws upon psychological explanations for
Yeah.
any of the relevant evidence rather than appealing to a literal resurrection. So,
Yeah, that's right.
what is that explanation that you have offered?
Well, I call it the RHBS model, which is
Mhm.
probably a little bit overly pompous for what it is, because it's mostly just an appeal to existing findings or concepts or ideas from like psychology, sociology, and a little bit of historical case study to explain how we might be able to account for the emergence of the belief, emergence of the sincere belief that Jesus had risen from the dead by his early followers. So the basic account in brief is that it's specifically formulated as a response to minimal facts versions of the arguments for resurrection, like Habermas or Craig defend. And so it attempts to account for those same facts just by not postulating a resurrection, right? So the idea is that the R stands for reburial. So the idea is that we account for the empty tomb, for Jesus' empty tomb, by the idea that his body was removed and reburied. Then the H stands for hallucinations. So the idea is that possibly the women followers who first found his tomb empty experienced bereavement hallucinations triggered by the context and grief of the situation, that they experienced individual hallucinations of Jesus appearing to them in some fashion. They then communicated this to the other disciples, who then had possibly additional individual experiences, which then again they further discussed together, and this sort of built expectation for further experiences, and then this leads to the collective religious experiences of the risen Jesus. Now, I want to emphasize here that I don't attempt to explain the precise details found in the Gospels, because the argument's a response to the minimal fact, which says that there were multiple collective experiences of the risen Jesus, but doesn't specify their form. So likewise, I don't attempt to account for that. I just attempt to explain how there could be collective experiences of the risen Jesus. And then, so I cite a number of sociological and psychological findings that are sort of relevant to how those sort of experiences are constructed. The B in the acronym stands for biases, and this is relevant to the idea that after the initial experiences, the disciples or whoever else experienced them had would have discussed the experiences with each other, would have recollected them, prayed about them, being reading the scriptures, and that would have reshaped their memories and understandings of what happened. The accounts probably became more impressive over time, more coherent across different people who were experiencing the same thing, but would have initially perceived it differently. But it's sort of make it more coherent via discussion and reflection on it, and the theological implications became sort of more drawn out and understand it, and it became understood in terms of resurrection specifically. And then the S stands for socialization. So this sort of refers to the process of becoming ingrained in this new belief system, enforced by like a fairly isolated social group with a fairly unique set of beliefs, and that doubt would have been marginalized, and people would have been encouraged through a variety of social practices to cohere their beliefs and understandings with what other people thought. And if there was residual doubts or concerns, probably people just kept it to themselves. So and so throughout, the idea is to cite a number of relevant psychological and sociological findings and previous miracles and paranormal claims to illustrate the plausibility of these different components of the argument. And obviously, there's the question of how sort of successful I am with that. But I regard this broad combination of processes as being sufficient to account for the historical data that we do have. And I think that it also is roughly what happens in most new religious movements or traditions that like belief systems that involve paranormal or supernatural events, that these similar sets of processes can be deployed to understand a range of human experiences, obviously with the suitable modifications for the context. And so it's a way of kind of naturalize the early Christian experience and understand it as brought about by a similar set of processes that brings about these things. And we know that these processes operate in other contexts. Obviously, I need to postulate that certain things happened at a certain time in the past in order to account for it, and I can't know definitively. So it's an inference to the best explanation. So that's broadly how the account works.
So, given that I haven't heard this model explained in detail until just now, let me offer you the kind of William Lane Craig-esque lines of response that
Yeah,
he's
sure.
given in similar contexts and see what your take is. The first would be that, well, so my first is a question. Do you grant the fact that Craig will argue for that Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea in Joseph of
Yeah, that's
Arimathea's
taken as an
private tomb?
assumption. Yeah.
Okay, so then the one component of your hypothesis is that Jesus's body was stolen. Is that right?
Well, I think it's possible it was stolen, but I typically argue for reburial as the more likely explanation.
Now, what does that consist of? I mean, who reburies it and why?
Again, I think there are different possibilities. Again, the one that I usually argue for is that the burial was only ever intended as temporary, just a temporary placement, really, rather than a proper burial, because the Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was near to the crucifixion site, and the Romans wanted a relatively private, out of the way location to place Jesus's body because they were concerned about continued unrest. And also there was sorry, I didn't explain why close is relevant. Close is relevant because, well, at least according to the Gospels, Jesus died near to the start of the Sabbath, and so there was a need to take his body down and place it somewhere before the Sabbath began, according to Jewish law. So a place nearby was called for, and a relatively private, out of the way place was also called for. And so they prevailed upon Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb happened to be nearby, to temporarily place the body there. And it was then moved on Saturday evening, as soon as the Sabbath was over, and placed in a communal burial site. I think there are other possibilities as well, but that's the one I typically defend as being, I think, most plausible.
Well, I can think of a few counter responses to what I'm about to ask. But then in that case, why wasn't Jesus's body exhumed by the relevant parties, whether it was the Jewish authorities or Joseph of Arimathea or whomever, and pointed to as the evidence that he didn't rise from the dead?
Yeah, this is a typical response. So, well, there's a number of issues here. I think that the simplest is to ask, how do we know that it wasn't? But even assuming that it wasn't, I think that it's readily understandable, as the disciples didn't begin to teach about the resurrection of Jesus until, well, it's unclear exactly how long later, but it only really needs to be a few days until the point where the corpse is unrecognizable. And that would have been rather pointless. But I also don't really find it convincing that would have really convinced anyone who was already a convicted follower of Jesus. This is one of the points that I discuss, irrational belief persistence. I think there's overwhelming evidence that those sorts of demonstrations would not have convinced someone who was a devout follower that their beliefs were false. Even if it convinced a handful, the movement could have still persisted.
So then moving to the hallucination aspect, Craig will often make the point that even if the relevant individuals, the disciples, his women followers, hallucinated appearances of Jesus, given the Jewish context within which they happened, they would not have come to the belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. Rather, the most likely outcome is they would have hallucinated visions of Jesus in heaven, as assumed into heaven. Because given the Jewish context, they had no expectation in their worldview of someone rising from the dead prior to the general resurrection. And so if there were hallucinations, it wouldn't have led to belief in an individual resurrection. It would have led to, if anything, belief of an assumption into heaven or exaltation in heaven or something like that. What would be your take on that?
So the first point I would make is that the fact that Jewish teaching prior to this seems to contradict the idea of the Messiah being resurrected sort of separately from the general resurrection is evidence against, or that's weakens the case for Jesus being the actual Messiah and the Son of God, because it seems to it requires an ad hoc modification of the previous religious context, which I think is something that apologists don't discuss enough. They advocate this as an evidence for Christianity, but I actually think it's evidence against. But putting that aside, the idea that that individual hallucinations would not have led to a belief that Jesus had been resurrected is possibly true if we just consider individual hallucinations. But remember, I also argue that there were collective experiences of the risen Jesus. I say experiences because hallucinations are psychologically a private phenomenon. So we shouldn't call them group hallucinations as some do, but we can call them experiences where people together had an experience that they interpreted as Jesus appearing to them. And this, may well have, I don't know the details of exactly what happened. I think that's lost to history, but it's quite possible that this could have included them coming to believe that Jesus interacted with objects or ate food and things like that. And so at that point, I don't think that there's anything that distinguishes Craig's account from my account, because Craig, as far as I can understand, he argues that the disciples came to believe that Jesus had been resurrected specifically because the tomb was empty and because Jesus appeared to them in a way that convinced them that it was some kind of bodily, physical appearance. And I argue the exact same. I argue that the tomb was empty and that the disciples came to believe that Jesus appeared to them in some sort of bodily, physical way. So it seems that the argument that they couldn't have formed the belief that he'd been resurrected in the one case but could have in the other just doesn't make any sense, because the explanatory work is being done by their psychological state, that what they believed, and that's argued to be the same in both cases.
To play Craig's advocate, I think what he would say to you, I'm fairly confident he would say that mischaracterizes the nature of the resurrection as an explanation for the origin of the disciples' belief. Rather, I think what he would say is the disciples came to believe Jesus was raised from the dead rather than assumed into heaven, or a more amenable theological category to their prior beliefs, because Jesus did physically appear to them, that Jesus was physically present to them, and that if they were merely hallucinations, that wouldn't explain the phenomenological characteristics of the appearances and the narratives that we do have. And so, given that they had appearances of Jesus alive rather than appearances of Jesus, or experiences of Jesus as alive rather than experiences of Jesus in heaven, that is what is better explained by the resurrection hypothesis. And so I just don't think he would point to the empty tomb as the main drive in thinking that Jesus was raised from the dead. Rather, it would be under this hypothesis because they experienced him as raised from the dead alive rather than exalted in heaven.
Well, again, I don't think that's my hypothesis says the same thing, that's how they experienced him, or at least that's how they came to believe they experienced him. So the account has to say something like, well, there couldn't have been any way, or there's no plausible way they came to believe they experienced Jesus as appearing to them physically if he didn't actually do that. And well, to that I would say, well, I think I've outlined the processes that could explain that, and I also think that it's just a very tenuous point to depend on. Like, how do you know that they couldn't have come to that belief? Craig makes a lot of assumptions about the psychology of these people from 2,000 years ago. And I think that those people point out that my assumptions are based on inferences from other religious traditions and from modern psychological experiments, and that they may not be applicable to the first century, which is absolutely fair. Like, there is an issue there about making extrapolations. But I think that the issue is that Craig and others also make a lot of psychological assumptions about what people would have been likely to believe or come to believe or find convincing at that time. And they base that on, as far as I can tell, absolutely no evidence at all. They're just making things up. And so I think if we want to have a serious discussion about what psychological states are plausible for, first century followers of Jesus, then that's a reasonable discussion to have, and you can critique my evidence. But I think that there's going to need to be some evidence put on the table on the part of the apologists as to why they make the arguments that they do. As far as I know, it's usually just asserted that they would or would not have believed this or that.
Yeah, I think the sword cuts both ways in that case. So those would be the four groups of arguments that Christians have offered for their worldview. And we've, I think, had a lot of good substantive back and forth on them. But then the second half of this article and of the explanation for why you're not a Christian would be the arguments you could give for thinking that Christianity is false. And the first group of arguments to identify is the evil and suffering in the world. And so the broad problem of evil. If a perfectly good, all-powerful God created the world, why is there so much evil and suffering? But before I put words in your mouth, what is that problem? Why do you think it's potentially a good reason to reject Christianity?
Yeah, so I think the problem of evil is a good argument against, at least traditional forms of theism. But it is going to be a bit contingent on what you think the nature of God is and what you think his reasons for creating are. So, but certainly if you think, as we discussed before with respect to the fine tuning argument, that God created in order to exemplify the morally good states of well-being or something like that, then it seems to me what you would expect is a universe that is optimized to maximally exemplify those valuable states. And well, quite frankly, it just seems like if that was God's objective, he's done a pretty poor job of it. And this raises, of course, the question as to how you know what things would have been counterfactually. If we think it's sort of obvious that getting rid of bone cancer in children, to use the stereotypical example, would be a net improvement, well, how can we be sure of that? Do we know what the world would have been like otherwise? And you can multiply the examples. I think there are many plausible examples that could be given of aspects of reality or states of affairs which, in any other context, everyone regards as bad and would be a good thing to eliminate. But in this context, tend to become controversial. And so I think that there's a tension there between sort of ordinary moral judgments or judgments about the value of states of affairs, and then the tendency to become quite skeptical of those in the context of this argument. So I'm just sort of preempting that kind of response, which I find like possible. Basically, a skeptical theist response is a possible response, but I think it's hard to reconcile a skeptical theist response about these sorts of issues and then also maintain that and also to sort of avoid similar skepticism about seemingly even much more controversial philosophical issues. Like if we're not sure that bone cancer in children is a net bad for the universe relative to what it could otherwise have been, then I'm not sure how we're going to reach confidence in a vast array of other claims about like fine tuning or cosmological arguments or whatever else. So I feel like that approach is a bit self-defeating, at least if the apologist wants to maintain any positive arguments for Christianity. They may not, by the way. They may simply want to fend off this, in which case I think that you can maybe run a skeptical theist argument. But the other line of defense against these sorts of observations is to say that is to try to give a theodicy of what type of goods are actualized or enabled by the existence of these evils. And to be honest, I've just found obviously I've not studied all of them, but I've just found the ones that I've heard to be very unconvincing. Though I suspect, possibly preempting, that some of the issues that were raised in the fine-tuning argument may be relevant here, because assessing whether a state of affairs is likely or not given theism is going to be dependent on what other opportunities you think God had, right? So if we consider the fine-tuning issues that were discussed before, if you take the laws of physics and psychophysical laws as given, then actually maybe God was very constrained in creation and he could only choose the constants. In which case, then the amount of suffering we have might be the least you can produce in a universe that has our laws and psychophysical laws, right? Now, I don't find that very convincing myself, but like if you bring similar, I guess the point I'm making is it seems I've been increasingly thinking that the fine-tuning argument and argument from evil and suffering are actually very closely connected. If you defend fine-tuning on the basis of what God wants to exemplify goods in creation, in which case you're essentially assessing the question is our reality the sort of reality you'd expect God to create?
Yes, I completely agree with you. And you're talking to the guy that wrote the paper, Skeptical Theism Undermines the Fine-Tuning Argument Mostly. So I've thought very hard about... Yes. I can't help but obnoxiously citing these papers because they're so relevant. But I thought very deeply about the relationship between the problem of evil, skeptical theism, and the fine-tuning argument. But I think the first point I would make is that insofar as you are advancing a cumulative case against Christianity, Your divine psychology objection to the fine tuning argument would also prevent you, it seems to me, from offering the problem of evil. Because if we can't reason about what kinds of things God would likely do, then we can't reason that God would likely not create a universe like this, right?
Potentially. So it depends what we're going to take as given under our assumptions. So yeah, a very strong forms of that objection would rule out the or yeah, a very strong anti-divine psychology perspective would, I think, rule out the problem of evil as a successful argument. Um, Now, the way I tend to think about this is that God had. Well, let me rephrase that. The way that I think about it, that I'm thinking about this lately, that connects the fine tuning and a problem of evil, is that if God's reason for creating was to exemplify uh, morally good states like well-being or something, then he had a vast array of possible ways of doing that, and that's where I appeal to non-physical forms of life, which I think that there are a multitude of ways that he could have done that are sort of morally distinct. Um, Whereas when it comes to, oh yeah, and so that's why it's sort of unclear why he created our particular reality. But then when you consider it from the other point of view of how much evil there is in the universe, it seems that he has particular reasons to not create this way. That is all of the evil and suffering that exists in our reality. So I guess they're sort of different sides of looking at the same coin. But if you might think that God has a reason to create um, certain types of worlds, which he might have a variety of reasons to create different types of worlds. That was more relevant to the fine tuning argument. You might also think that God has a reason to sort of avoid certain types of creations, and in that case, you don't necessarily need to know what he would create. You might think that it's quite hard to say because you don't know enough details about the divine psychology, but you know enough to say that he wouldn't create this. And that seems to be a bit of a distinction, because fine tuning seems to want to say something about what God did create or what he had reason to create, whereas evil is more about, well, we don't necessarily know what he would have created, but we don't think it would be this. I know that's not like a strict dichotomy because they're both relevant to assessing those arguments, but that's kind of how I think about the relationship between the two.
Mm. Yeah, it would depend on the reasons that motivate
Exactly.
your
Yes.
ignorance about divine psychology, what you cite as the
Yeah.
reason. So I could see
Exactly what
how,
is being appealed to. Yeah.
right, I could see how your appeal to the vast plenitude of creative options on God's part for realizing these goods would not necessarily undermine reasoning about God and evil. So I'd have to think about that. I myself, when it comes to skeptical theism, have been more and more convinced that most forms of skeptical theism are not tenable for largely the reasons you outline and others, or at least that I don't find plausible on their face. There's one that I'm more open to than the rest, and that would be Kirk Durston's consequential complexity argument for skeptical theism, which bears resemblance to William Lane Craig's comments about the problem of evil, although Craig never develops them to nearly as the level of philosophical sophistication, which is just the point that you made in more detail, that the that historical events are interconnected to such a great degree that we don't really know what would have been the case if we take out a certain historical event. And that prevents us from reasoning about how the world would have been different without this event and therefore would have been better or worse. Now, it may be that kind of an argument assumes consequentialism about ethics, that what one ought to do is determined solely by the value of the consequences of one's actions. Maybe, maybe not. But I think on its face anyway, that's a plausible claim that if we that the effects of changing a certain event are compound over time. Little changes accumulate into hugely divergent histories. And from that perspective, it would seem that only an omniscient or near omniscient mind could make the judgment call about which events are required for certain ends and which are not. What would be your take on that rough response?
I think that there is something to that, though perhaps unsurprisingly, I ultimately think that line of reasoning leads us more to atheism than theism. But to stay focused here, um, there's sort of two broad concerns. One is that I think that we can, and in other contexts do, unequivocally state that at least some historical events um, are just bad. The Holocaust would be an example, right? And it seems like those sorts of judgments, I mean, we could talk about how we make those judgments and the criteria, but I think at the end of the day, those judgments are pretty secure. And if a belief requires me to revise those, I'm going to be pretty skeptical about that belief. So that's one concern. Um, a second concern is that relates to what we were talking about before about what God's creative freedom is or what options he has available. And I think that it's perfectly reasonable to say that we can't reason very confidently about what the consequences are of changing historical events or of changing aspects of nature and things like that would be. I think that that's quite difficult. However, I think that it's plausible to argue that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being could have come up with something better. And it seems like you have to come up with reasons why that sort of constrain his creative options. And this is like is it Plantinga who argues for the free will argument against the logical problem of evil? It's he, right? Yeah, yeah. So that's like one example. I'm not super impressed by that, but like that would be one example of trying to narrow the range of possibilities about what God's creative options are. But I think that, I think that the argument from evil is implicitly making an appeal to some degree, intuitive arguments about creative possibilities that we can conceive of that seem, at least on the face of it, to lead to a better world than the one we have. And I agree that you can never fully justify those because only an omniscient mind could work through all of those. But then the contrary appeal I make to that as well. But ordinary morality in any other context, we feel comfortable making these sorts of judgments, even if provisionally. And so there does seem to be a bit of special pleading if we're to say that that those only become invalid when we apply those considerations to reasoning about what sort of creation we would expect to see in the existence of God, given the existence of God.
My biggest worry about that line of response would be the same, that it might very well be inconsistent with our normal moral intuitions about our obligations and lack thereof, and our ordinary evaluations of the moral status of different states of affairs. It's going to be really hard to consistently say, on the one hand, that God may well have been justified in allowing the Holocaust because we just don't know the consequences that would have obtained if we take the Holocaust out of the historical timeline. But then on the other hand, to say the Holocaust was evil, and if we had been able to stop it, we should have. We want to say the latter, absolutely. I mean, if anyone doesn't say the latter, I mean, I'm more certain of that than anything else, really. And so how do we consistently say that second thing, but also the first? I don't know. And I'd have to think about that more. But I would far and away give up skeptical theism before I gave up the belief that the Holocaust was evil. And if I had the ability to stop it, it would have been my absolute duty to stop it.
Yeah, so I think that I agree with that. And I also think that it's just implausible to postulate that the best universe God can create, or the one that he wants to create, is one with Holocaust in it. Like you have to postulate he has some reason for doing that. We can't know if he has that reason, right? It's a postulate, but I just find it very implausible. Given, again, it depends what you assume about God and his creative freedoms, right? So we sort of touched on that earlier, but I personally find that quite implausible.
Well, I think the consequential complexity argument is going to be stronger if we combine it with the view that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that God does not determine. So that would, in the way that Plantinga outlines, and I don't think we need to get into it, but that would serve to delimit the range of creative options God has, because he just can't create logically possible worlds where the free agents therein do differently than what the counterfactuals indicate they would do. So that's one way. And if you add those in, I think that would make the argument stronger anyway. But debating the existence of counterfactuals is...
Yeah, I mean, it's an existence claim rather than a demonstration of how plausible it is that all of these other possible worlds are blocked off by counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, especially when it comes to issues relating to like natural evils that aren't contingent on at least any human agency. Of course, I think Plantinga argues that they could be contingent on some non-human agency, but I think that these, whether Plantinga's argument goes through as an existence, like to block the logical argument, is one issue. I know Oppie has his criticisms of it, but I don't think that necessarily tells you much about how plausible it is that like the actual world is one in which all better worlds are blocked by some counterfactual of creaturely freedom. It still seems quite unlikely that would be the case to me. But maybe you can come up with a model where that's not the case. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, part of that will come down to who has the burden of proof. And I think, insofar as the atheist is offering the problem of evil, to a degree, they will be the ones who have to give some reason to think that the counterfactuals do not block off better worlds, rather than the theist who needs to show that the counterfactuals do block off better worlds,
No,
at
I
least
don't
on
really
its
believe
face,
in the burden of
anyway.
proof in philosophical context. I just think it's a question of what's more reasonable to believe. But yeah, I mean, some
Right,
account needs to be given, of
right,
course, about that. But um, and
right. We'll have to have a right.
yeah, inevitably you have to get to a discussion about what you think God could have otherwise done.
Right. We would have to have a reason for thinking that the counterfactuals do not block off better worlds, I think would just be my point, rather than
Yeah,
merely
that's fair.
lacking
That's
a
fair.
reason. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, then that takes us to the second group of arguments against Christianity, which is the problem or problems of religious disagreement, religious confusion. I'm sorry. What is that problem?
Well, I think that there's sort of different levels of this. One is so Christianity is a revealed religion which makes the claim that God has particular beliefs that he wants humans to hold, essentially, and certain practices he wants them to engage in. Different Christians have somewhat different views about this, but we'll get to that. But the meta point is that there is something that God wants us to think and do, and he has communicated that to us through, at least in part, through revelation, like through scriptures or the person of Jesus and events like this. And so assessing that claim as a claim about the nature of God and his desires with respect to humanity, it seems to run. It seems to be inconsistent with what we actually observe about human history, which is that the information that people have access to with respect to God's alleged revelations are highly spotty and inconsistent and geographically and historically contingent, which is very expected under naturalism. It seems much less expected if we think that there's an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God who wants everyone to have access to this information. So this is a general observation about the historical and geographic contingency of religious belief and where it emerges and who didn't have access to information about Christianity and things like that. Yeah, it doesn't seem at all inconsistent with what would be expected by a God who's in the business of wanting people to come into a personal, loving relationship with him. So that's the kind of cross-religious argument. Then within Christianity, there's a more targeted concern, which is that Christians don't seem to be very good at agreeing about what exactly they believe. Now, this doesn't necessarily, well, you can try to formulate a minimal version of Christianity, like a mere Christianity, which avoids these issues. I don't know how successful that is because not many people seem to believe a mere Christianity. And so there's still going to be the question of why is the Bible so unclear that apparently sincere and thoughtful people can't agree on what it says about pretty core issues, and why do different denominations have such different ways of understanding their faith and even different books in their Bibles and things like this. So many heresies over the years and theological disputes. And even the question as to what counts as what would be included as the mere Christianity is itself highly controversial. So I don't think that's a particularly plausible objection. So the claim is something like that: if Christianity was divinely inspired, we would expect there to be more clarity about key doctrinal points than there appears to be, which I think favors the idea that the practice and beliefs of Christianity are the product of human writing and human foibles and disagreements and power struggles and all this sort of stuff, rather than being the product of divine inspiration and guiding of history.
So this problem bothers me as well. And I think it has a core plausibility to it. I also think that it's pretty clear that the likelihood of this level of religious confusion and the connection between one's geographical origins and religious beliefs and the disagreements among Christians, all of that has a pretty decent or high likelihood given naturalism. That seems right to me. I don't know how to argue against that. I think the best bet for the Christian or the theist would be to contend that the relevant evidence here that you've delineated has an inscrutable likelihood given Christianity, that we just can't evaluate what kind of a circumstance of religious agreement or lack thereof we should expect if Christianity is true. And again, I think the best bet for that kind of option would be the same that you would give in the problem of evil, which would be a consequential complexity argument that also given Molinism as well, supplemented with a Molinist framework where there are counterfactuals of freedom. And so I think that's the best bet. I'm not sure that it works. I've never thought it through in this particular context, but it would just be to say that the best we can do, we can't show that these things would be high given theism, but we could just show that it's inscrutable. And then you would have to assume this kind of meta principle that when evidence is inscrutable on some hypothesis, even if it's high given another one, the evidence can't adjudicate between them. Rough and ready, what I think is the best bet for dealing with it, other than just trying to outweigh the evidential significance of religious disagreement with other successful arguments for Christianity. That would be a second tier type of response I would give, which of course you would say, all right, well, but which I'll just finish the point, which is that then you would say, well, sure, you could give a cumulative case, but then we'd have to debate the merits of it. So it's not very dialectically effective. But I'm curious about that first kind of point, that's just inscrutable given the complexity, blah, 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 blah.
I don't find it very convincing. I mean, it's similar in many ways to the problem of evil, but a little bit more, somewhat differently targeted. Again, it does depend a bit on the Christian tradition that you are in, because not everyone agrees that God is interested in, forming a loving relation with everyone. But if you do believe that, which seems to be the majority position, then it just seems like he's really bad at doing that. And you have to come up with sort of unknown, inscrutable reasons as to why he couldn't do a better job. I just don't find that very plausible given an omnipotent and omniscient being. I think that that's the crux of it. There's more specifics that can be said about, and again, it's always going to depend on what you think that God's alternative options were. And you can always make ad hoc assumptions about that constrain those. But I think that the position just becomes increasingly less plausible. That it starts out, this is a bit of an unfair characterization, but I mean, you can react to it. I always find there's a bit of a bait and switch where someone tells me about God. He's omnipotent and omniscient. He's the greatest conceivable being, and he loves you, and he's in charge of everything. I'm like, oh wow, that sounds pretty awesome. But then I look around and like, well, it doesn't seem to be done a very good job of communicating what he wants of people. It could have been a bit clearer, perhaps. Could have tried a bit harder to communicate to people in China or whatever. And then, there's unclear reasons that prevent him from doing that. Like, he did the best he could of difficult metaphysical circumstances. I'm like, oh, okay. What about all this bone cancer in kids and like natural disasters and horrible stuff that happens? And it's like, again, he did the best he could. There's like complicated reasons that he couldn't have actualized better states of affairs. Like, okay. This God doesn't sound that great. Like, it seems like there's always excuses as to why things aren't seemingly better in ways that would apparently be within his power to do. That's the kind of reaction that I have to a lot of these kind of issues. Feel free to respond.
Well, I get that. I get that I get the reason you'd have that response, and I'm sympathetic to it. But I mean, at a base point, it doesn't show that the philosophically sophisticated responses to atheistic arguments are failures, because they would say that characterizing them as excuses is to mischaracterize them. That actually these are fundamental points about the limits of human cognitive ability, and that it is the most plausible response to our limitations is to say that when it comes to a perfect being, a maximally great being, given those limitations, given, say, the complexity of history and the interconnected nature of historical events, given our lack of access to counterfactuals of freedom, it just is the case that we don't know nearly enough to make the claim that there is a better set of circumstances or possible world that would do better than this one at achieving the relevant goods, or at decreasing the relevant evils. And maybe that's wrong, but I mean, I don't think it's enough to just say, well, that makes out God to be not that great. Well, you'd have to say why, right? Like you'd have to show that the response doesn't work.
Well, yeah, of course. I didn't say that the crude characterization is sufficient, but I do think that it's a correct characterization that these positions are excuses, because I regard them as all ad hoc modifications of an initial position that are not well justified. And again, obviously you have to work through that, right? About why they're not satisfied, but yeah, why they're not justified positions to take. But I think that it's often what am I trying to say here? The I think the cognitive limitations is used very inconsistently. It seems to be appealed to when we, like, for example, Craig makes, I mean, I'm not saddling you with an argument just because Craig makes it, but Craig makes a cosmological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, right? And one of the things that he does as part of that argument is to argue against various naturalistic explanations of the origins of the universe, right? Different possibilities. Now, a very natural response there is to say that we have cognitive limitations that prevent us from understanding that. Well, not even just cognitive, but like epistemic limitations that we can't access enough information about what happened then. And what the beginnings of time and space even really mean and things like that. And I never hear theists appeal to these in that context. I'm not saying there haven't been any, right? But it sounds like somehow these limitations all go away when it seems like they're all just as relevant to a situation like that. Or the argument that I give, the response that I give to the fine-tuning argument, which is that we are in no position to know what types of life would be possible with at least most other combinations of constants. And that argument is usually not considered very seriously. It's like, oh, well, we can know well enough, and vague intuitive arguments are made. I think that's inconsistent to, again, I'm not saying that you say this, right? It's not a personal criticism. It's just a reflection that I think that these sorts of arguments are appealed to inconsistently about what exactly are the limitations of of the human epistemic position, of human cognition. I think that if you apply these sort of consistently across a range of theistic arguments, I'm not exactly sure where you'd get to, but I don't think you're in a position where you can affirm really any of the traditional arguments for the existence of God. I think maybe you're agnostic or something. But maybe maybe it's just the case that, look, the arguments go through in the fine tuning and the cosmological case, and they don't go through in the evil case. So you do have to actually discuss the particulars on its merits. I'm not saying this general observation trumps that. I'm just explaining it as a kind of a background concern or motivator that I have, that I find these sorts of appeals to be very questionable. But yeah, so feel free to react or to not. It's not really an argument. It's more just explaining where I'm coming at it from.
Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable, and I actually second your claim about inconsistency in the case of the Kalam cosmological argument. I've never been impressed with so-called stage 2 of the Kalam argument, where you connect the conclusion that there is a cause of the universe to then the further conclusion that it was something recognizably supernatural or divine that brought it about. Because I agree with you that I don't see any reason to think that we're in the right position to assess the various competing options about what could have caused the universe to come into being. And if that's the case, then the mere fact that we can't think of a third alternative, say, in addition to an unembodied mind or an abstract object, well, it just doesn't mean that much then. If we wouldn't be in a position anyway to gauge what, if even if there were a multitude of other options, we wouldn't know what they were. I think that's pretty reasonable. And then it will just depend on the particularities about whether or not that point about cognitive limitation undermines the relevant theistic argument. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. You'd have to, in the end, go through them on a case-by-case basis. But I do have sympathy. I do have sympathy for that general impression that the theistic position becomes ad hoc, or principles are applied inconsistently. Whether it bears it all out in the final analysis, I don't know. And I just find that even one of these arguments, like the fine-tuning argument, is enormously complex. And so I don't know that I'll ever get to a point where I can feel well-read and well-versed enough to make a summative assessment of all of the arguments together, pro and con, at least to my level of satisfaction. Maybe you can do it by going more coarse-grained and offering something of a different kind of holistic judgment, but it just wouldn't be the kind of thing that I'm after, which is a really thorough acquaintance with all the relevant issues and coming to some summative assessment. I don't know that anybody can do that.
Yeah, that's a very high bar, and this is a broad concern that I have, which relates to the problem of peer disagreement, right? Where there's always issues. Well, peer disagreement as a problem exists even if you've actually read everything and know everything about the issue, and there's just someone who is in a similar position and they disagree with your summative assessment, right? So that's a problem. But I think it becomes even more pronounced when no one is in that epistemic position. Everyone's in slightly different positions, having read slightly different things and thought about it in slightly different ways. But there's no real, I mean, maybe there's some people you can rule out as clearly not being at the same level, but there's a lot of people in apparently similar epistemic positions, but who come to vastly different assessments. And how do you respond to that, given the fact that you know there are many things that you don't know and many arguments you haven't heard and issues you haven't explored? And I think that this is actually a very serious issue, not just about religion, but about other things as well, which is essentially the reason why I say the probability of God's existence, or some God's existence, is 10%. That is not a reflection of my own assessment of the plausibility. I regard personally, if you ask me, the probability of God existing is almost nil. But that's just, the 10% is entirely a sort of order of magnitude estimate of like what philosophers think, really. You could quibble about the exact number, but like the point is that almost all of that's coming from conciliating to other people's judgments. And so I think that we should be very cognizant of this limitation, of our own limitations.
So I'm really glad you mentioned the 10% figure, because it was brought up near the beginning and we never got back to it. And I was like, should I bring it up here at the end? It's something I wanted to talk to you about. So good. But my response to that, so the background is that various surveys of professional philosophers have been carried out, like is it Chalmers-Bourget survey that I think came out in the most recent version came out in 2020, that indicated something like 17% of philosophers are theists and the rest are agnostic or atheist. And I've also read your article about how then you come up with the 10%, but it's basically it would seem that the consensus opinion among philosophers is that we should be agnostic or atheist. Now, I had a reaction to that then mirrored almost exactly the remarks given by Randall Rouser in a video responding to that exact same argument. And I found that video by happenstance, by coincidence, like the next day after reading your article. And so I thought someone is paying too much attention to me and is feeding this into the algorithm. But I think my basic response would be that while it is correct that philosophers in general are well-versed in assessing the validity and cogency of arguments, all philosophers are going to be good at that because they're trained in the philosophical method of critical thinking. Nevertheless, I'm just not bothered as a theist by the fact that philosophers in general tend to be atheistic or agnostic, because I find that outside the field of philosophy of religion, philosophers' acquaintance with theistic arguments or atheistic arguments is very little. And they tend to have very unsophisticated views on these arguments, or their acquaintance with these arguments is very unsophisticated, and they have no profound knowledge of the relevant issues. I mean, that's not indicting philosophers specifically for not understanding philosophy of religion. I think that when you just come to understand what philosophy is, it is such a huge, expansive field that the collective opinion of philosophers on some very specific issue is just not that significant. I mean, for instance, the opinion of a philosopher of law, or of an ethicist, or of a logician, or of a philosopher of mathematics about the fine-tuning argument, for example, that's just not by itself very significant at all to me, because they just don't have a profound knowledge of the relevant literature. Now, that isn't to say then, okay, well then let's zoom in on what philosophers of religion think. Well, if you did that, you would find that most philosophers of religion are Christian, not just theists, but are Christian. And that's not significant because because there's a self-selection effect of the people that go into philosophy of religion. They tend to already be religious. So
Well,
I
and
think
also
that
how people label themselves in the survey, like what subfield they choose to identify with.
And so, yeah, so I think that you just can't make one way or another an appeal to the relevant authorities. That the only option you have if you want to determine whether these arguments succeed is to just look at them for yourself. And so that there isn't a relevant appeal to authority one way or the other. So that would be my response. What do you take?
I think that's clearly wrong in the sense that you could argue with my 10% figure, absolutely. But what I don't think you can argue with is the idea that there is a lot of disagreement amongst epistemic peers. Even if you take the philosophy of religion figure, I don't know, it's like 60%, theist or something like that. Last I remember looking at it, but it's not like 99%, right? And the point is that there's more than enough examples of people with knowledge of these different areas who disagree, I think, to moderate away from very strong commitments. Now, exactly how much moderation do we have to do? Well, that's unclear, but I think that um, my opinion is that there's enough of that, irrespective of the precise details that we use to, like, I think that your inference is just too strong. The considerations that you've raised are very important and relevant, but your conclusion, I think, is too strong, which is just to completely ignore this issue of, like, exactly how to moderate our opinions in response to evidence of peer disagreement. And I think that's far too strong. I think that even if you don't know exactly how much to moderate, you can make an estimate as to how much to moderate. The 10% is my estimate of what's appropriate. To respond specifically to the criticism that most philosophers outside of philosophy of religion don't know much about philosophy of religion, I completely agree with that. I do think that many philosophers are not very interested in philosophy of religion because they have other reasons that essentially rule out theism that have no bearing on, like, the fine-tuning argument. An example for me would be my views about mind. I think that immaterial minds are simply impossible, like metaphysically impossible, in which case any traditional conception of God, at least, is ruled out on, like, if you take that as a starting point, right, then the other arguments don't really matter. Now, I don't know that every philosopher is in exactly that position. There are going to be different frameworks, positions that people come from, obviously, but they're going to have their own reasons for justifying exactly why they think what they do about God. Some of them will be good, some of them won't be. So I think that, the 10% is not a very precise figure. I call it an order of magnitude estimate. As representing a kind of a sizable minority view. If you said it should be 20%, I'd be like, yeah, I don't have a strong reason for saying that it's not 20%. I just kind of like the 10% figure as being a nice sort of simple number to give. But yeah, but irrespective of the exact number, I think the right response is to moderate our own judgment significantly in the direction of in my opinion, significantly in the direction of the what other people think, which is a mixed bag. Now, how mixed should it be? I don't know, but I think if you're arguing for all things considered, conciliated views of, like, more than 99% either way, I personally think it's quite hard to sustain that. If you're arguing for conciliated views of more than 99%, and what I mean by that is not your own judgment of the arguments, but your final position after having incorporated the effect of disagreement, the fact that you might be wrong, your probability after that, if you're arguing that it should be more than 99% certain either way, I think that's too strong.
So, good correction, because I agree with you. Totally agree with you. There is some impact that peer disagreement ought to have on one's confidence in theism. And I do agree with you that it is to move it in the downward direction, because you can't, I agree, you can't be certain or 99% confident after taking account of the fact that all of these things are so complex and the relevant experts do disagree to some extent. What I would take issue with is that there's any argument for atheism among the peer disagreement. So I think 10% as the final probability that God exists, given the opinion of the experts, I think that's far too low. And we could, and that wouldn't be quibbling about details, right? I mean, it's the difference between having a justified but weaker belief in God versus having a justified belief that God does not exist. I mean, that's a hugely significant difference. So a lot will depend on the precise numbers you give, or rather whether it's above 50% or below. I mean, that's pretty significant. So, but I agree with you that we should have a moderating, the fact that peers, relevant experts disagree should have a moderating effect. Now,
and that I should, just to clarify,
well,
that 10%
hold on,
number is. Oh, sorry.
Let me just rattle off one more response, which was to your specific claim that. Now I have to make sure that I remember, but you responded specifically to one point that I made by saying, I can't remember. I can't remember specifically
the point
what
about
it was.
philosophers not having knowledge of the theistic of the argument.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. So there is going to be crossover between different philosophical views, and specifically between viewpoints on issues that don't fall specifically within philosophy of religion. So I agree with you. If you have pretty powerful arguments for physicalism, for the idea that everything that exists is physical, and that's a position within philosophy of mind, that will give you grounds for atheism. But my point would then be that the relevant question then is not, does this philosopher of religion have, or does this philosopher have a good argument or a strong argument for that considered in isolation is a good argument for atheism? But all of the evidence taken together, does that justify theism or atheism? And in order to justify that claim, you'd have to consider all of the arguments, including the ones within philosophy of religion, because it might be the case that, for all you know, as a philosopher of mind, for instance, that the theistic arguments actually outweigh the arguments you have for physicalism. And so, in order to uh, come to a consensus opinion that's significant for me to adjudicate whether I should be a theist or an atheist, you'd have to take into account the arguments within philosophy of religion. And if you as a philosopher haven't done that, well, then an appeal to authority just won't be nearly as strong, because you haven't looked at whether there are arguments on the other side of the scale that outweigh your, say, physicalist beliefs.
Yeah, I think that argument applies in reverse to philosophers who specialize in philosophy of religion. And the issue is that that there are many issues that are not discussed there that have a lot of bearing on philosophy of religion, like issues of philosophy of mind or epistemology, metaphysics as well. And a lot of views that philosophers take just rule out at least traditional forms of theism, and that's why they're not very interested in them. So I think that at the end of the day, this is why I think it's best to update on the overall figure, because I think that philosophers of religion, I mean, there's an issue of labeling, which I think kind of confounds it as well. It's just people who are more interested in the religion aspect specifically are more likely to identify as religious, and also more likely to think that that's important for their philosophical work. But even putting that aside, philosophers who specialize in arguments that fall within philosophy of religion specialize in a small subset of issues that are relevant to the overall worldview comparison question. And I don't actually know that I would, like, maybe you can argue they should be weighted more highly than, like, maybe philosophy of law like should get a lower rating, right? So we could argue about how you might like weight the different subfields. But personally, I find the argument that other philosophers aren't as relevant because they don't focus on those arguments isn't very convincing, because there are only one small subset of arguments that are relevant. And I actually tend to think that many other arguments are even more relevant to the overall question as to theism versus non-theism. So yeah, you do need to make, the point here is that you need to make an assessment when doing these adjustments about who the relevant experts are. I also think that the fact that many top scientists don't regard are not theists is, I think I wrote about this, is epistemically relevant. We could obviously just debate that because they're not going to have much knowledge about arguments in philosophy of religion, right? I'm not saying that that is why it's epistemically relevant, but I think that they often have, well, I don't really want to get into the details of that, but I think that their knowledge of like the natural world is sort of relevant in some ways there, and how they think about things. So the point is, when doing this assessment, you're going to need to make a judgment about who to appeal to. Like, one very crude way is, let's just take global surveys about how many people are theists and atheists, and conciliate that way, right? Now, I don't think that that is particularly informative. I think, and then you could say, well, you might say, you don't think that the percentage of overall philosophers who think that God exists is particularly informative. Maybe it's a bit more informative than an overall survey, but not very much so, perhaps you would say. And I think, again, there's just a long discussion to be had about exactly how you assess that. I think that it is that thinking about these issues, my view is that it's sort of gives us, well, I'll say from me, because the 10% is really an epistemic statement about my all things considered probability. And it pushes me up to about that level, based on thinking about all of the relevant factors about how people evaluate their worldviews. One big limitation, actually, of this survey evidence is that it is pretty limited to the Anglosphere. And so it would be interesting to see a more representative survey of philosophers who don't publish in English. Though there's, of course, cultural restrictions or like actual laws about what positions you can advocate in some countries. So that's another issue. So the empirics of it become very messy, which is why, again, I call it an order of magnitude estimate based on how I assess the relevant experts. But there's obviously a question to be had there about who are the relevant experts, or who we should be conciliating to. Because maybe, like, according to some views, we should conciliate towards spiritual authorities, right? Like, if it's a spiritual exercise and not a rational exercise, what would the philosophers know about it? So
I mean,
they're
I
irrelevant.
wouldn't. Sure. I wouldn't give that response. I just
No, I know
to
you
come
wouldn't,
back.
but like you could make that response depending on what your position is about the nature of knowledge of God, right?
Mhm. But yeah, but I don't think it'd be a reasonable one, and you and I agree with that. Agree on that point. But I think that I just have so little confidence in the uh, opinions pertaining to issues within philosophy of religion of my fellow philosophers who are outside of philosophy of religion. I think that over time, philosophy of religion has become more legitimized in the eyes of philosophers as a whole. I think that's the trend. But I still think it's the case that the vast, vast majority of philosophers whose specialty and area of focus is not philosophy of religion, for the vast majority of such philosophers, they just have almost no acquaintance with the contemporary conversation surrounding theistic arguments or atheistic arguments, that it just doesn't bother me in the slightest that they think that there's no good argument for theistic belief. Well, you haven't spent really any time at all looking into it. And maybe that's just a reflection of my own arrogance, but I do think it's the case that the even the accomplished metaphysician whose uh, area of expertise would be most closely related to philosophy of religion, that they would just dismiss these arguments based on uh, their acquaintance with what was once the conversation maybe 50 years ago, and they just have no idea what's been discussed since then. That's not always the case. Like Barry Lower has sophisticated, he's a philosopher of science. He has sophisticated objections to the fine-tuning argument. But I think given the nature of philosophy as a whole and how widely, how huge it is as a field, the fact that you do have to specialize to a large degree in certain views, you're just not going to be aware of what's going on in a different field. And
Yes, but
you
again,
do,
I don't.
right, go ahead, go ahead.
I agree with that. What I don't accept is that philosophy of religion is like the subspecialty of most relevance for determining whether God exists. I consider philosophy of religion as being a subfield that focuses on certain types of arguments about the nature of God and certain types of arguments for the existence of God. But there are many positions that you can take, or there are many other issues that are relevant that are just not discussed in philosophy of religion. So the exact argument can be made in reverse, that about the metaphysician or epistemologist or whoever else, philosopher of mind, who thinks that the philosophers of religion are wasting their time because they're debating about all these issues that are superfluous and irrelevant, and they don't know about the important issues that just on the face of it rule out any consideration of theism. Or I don't know exactly how they'd frame it, right? You'd have to talk to them. But the point is that I think it just seems to me that well, maybe this is a bit strong, but I think one issue is to assume that the relevant field of expertise is philosophy of religion. And the name notwithstanding, I just don't really agree with that, because it's a disciplinary label that describes a focus on certain types of arguments. It's not necessarily what you would. A more relevant consideration is what are the issues that are relevant to the existence of God, and anyone who spends a lot of time focusing on any of those should be considered relevant. Because even within philosophy of religion, obviously you focus on different arguments, right? Different people focus on different things, and no one is going to have a comprehensive knowledge. So this argument that, well, people just believe in trite stock opinions or rely on their prejudices for anything that's outside of their area of expertise, it seems to me that applies just as much to the philosophers of religion. And so what you'd want to do is a survey of philosophy considering all issues that are of importance for the existence of God, which is a large number, not everything, but a lot. And it seems anyone working in that area would have a claim to have some say to this. So I just fundamentally don't accept that just because it has the label philosophy of religion means that is the discipline, that we should just listen to them.
Well, I think it'll come down to whether or not you think that philosophers of religion do a good job with philosophy of religion. Paul Draper has made the point, and he's absolutely correct, that doing philosophy of religion quickly spills over into every other sub area of philosophy. And I think that's absolutely right. And so in order to do philosophy of religion well, you have to be a good philosopher, period. And so I don't
But
think
to do
the
other
reverse
areas of
argument,
philosophy, well, you don't have
let
to be
me
a good
hold on, hold
philosopher,
on.
seems to be what you're saying. That seems a bit unfair to me.
Well, wait. Let me just finish the point.
Okay, sure.
That
sure.
And so for that reason, in order to be a good philosopher of religion, you have to be a good philosopher. And so I don't think you can run the reverse argument, because I don't think I'm saying, or the philosopher of religion is saying, that work being done in outside areas is irrelevant to their conclusions. And so you couldn't then make the reverse argument that the people outside of philosophy of religion would then just look in philosophy of religion saying, well, that's all irrelevant because they're not considering these other things. I think by and large, or at least much of the time, some of the time, philosophers of religion do take into consideration the relevance of these outside disputes in metaphysics and epistemology, because you have to do philosophy of religion well. I don't remember the philosopher specifically who made this point, but philosophy of religion he compared to the center of an old wagon wheel, and with which you have all the wooden spokes intersecting it. And so then philosophy of religion is often like comparing it to philosophy is the center of that spoke within which all other areas of philosophy intersect. I mean, that's been my experience. And none of that is to say that we can have an appeal to expertise wherein philosophers of religion largely believe in God and therefore God exists. I don't think you can do that for the reasons of bias and the self-selection effect and labeling of how you go into it. But it's just my experience that you would have to take into account, like I said, with physicalism and so on. If all you've done is investigated the arguments within philosophy of mind journals, and then you conclude, well, physicalism is true given these things, that bears some weight. But it wouldn't automatically follow that all the arguments, the fine-tuning argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, and so on, are failures, because those would just weigh against the arguments for physicalism. And so you'd have to step back and take into account all of them together, I think. And doing that's just enormously complicated. And so I would just say that we should be agnostic if we're looking at expert opinion, because it's just not sufficient to nail it down. It's too complicated. So I wouldn't see atheism as the inference.
Well, you agreed before that some conciliation is appropriate, and potentially, I mean, because credences can vary anywhere from 0 to 1. If you look at it on a log scale, you could have very high credences in God's existence or in atheism, and you agreed before that anything more than say 1%, like 99 to 1%, would be inappropriate. So that's actually a potentially huge update on the basis of on the basis of the sort of peer disagreement conciliation argument. So I think it's inconsistent to say on the one hand a very large update is appropriate if you had at least more extreme views previous to considering that, but then on the other hand say that we can't really make a judgment about how much we should update. Like you might say that we can't be as precise as 10%. Like that's perfectly consistent. Or you might say the probability should be different. But I think that you can't on the one hand say that a large update is appropriate, and then on the other hand say, but we don't know how to respond to this evidence. Like, because you've just said that we do know how to respond to this evidence fairly specifically, like enough to change your credence by orders of magnitude, on the log scale. If it was 99.999%, it should be significantly different from that. So it seems you are saying we know how to update on the basis of this evidence. You're just disagreeing about my 10% number.
Yes. So I did. That's right. That's right. I mean, I think, as I said, that I don't see this as an argument for atheism. That the most I think that would follow is that it should temper us to agnosticism.
I haven't characterized it as an argument for atheism. I've said that I think that a good estimate for the probability of God's existence, sort of an all things considered conciliated view, is 10%, and I've granted that on the basis of certain survey evidence. And you're quite right to argue about the details of that, as we have been doing. But where I object is then to say, oh, well, we just don't know enough, so we should be, so we can't update on this evidence. I think, well, we both agree that you can. We're just arguing about the details of it.
That's right. That's right. So when I say agnosticism, I mean not agnosticism about expert opinion or what to do, but agnosticism about God's existence. So maybe, again, I don't even think that, because I am a theist, but I agree with you that it ought to cause some shift in the downward direction, given the lack of consensus about the success of these arguments and the complexity thereof. And how much, I don't know.
Sure,
how much I don't know,
but I do feel the need to respond to this idea that philosophy of religion is like the spoke at the center of the hub at the center of the wheel. I just fundamentally reject that. It's a picture of philosophy, but I mean, obviously we're going to differ about that. But I think that's a bit of a self-important view as a philosophy of religion, to be honest. But maybe it is. That's just my take.
So it might be, and I will temper it in the fact that I haven't ever reflected too deeply on that specific question. And I do incline to think it. I mean, I'll stick my neck out and say that. But fair enough. I can recognize the fact that my expertise has always been, and interest has always been, philosophy of religion. So of course, it's very natural for me to then say that it would be the one that. Well, it wouldn't be to say it's the most important. It would just be to say that assessing questions of religious significance requires grounding in philosophy as a whole. So I think it's important not to jump from that to a claim about value, about the value of
Yeah,
philosophy of
right,
religion
sure.
compared to the value of other fields. That is something I would not claim. But maybe there is overlap, and so I should be careful there.
Yeah, fair enough.
Merely because I know we're rounding out 2 hours here, but merely because of my obsession with completeness, do you want to briefly comment on the third and final argument
Yeah,
against
let's finish them
Christianity?
out.
Yeah, just because we got to finish now. We're so close to the end. Um, Evils done in the name of Christianity through history. Go for it.
Oh, yeah, so I forgot that this was there, actually. So, I think this is the weakest of the considerations, but I think what it raises an issue about is the nature of sort of revelation, or the nature of the efficacy of spiritual action in the world. So many Christians claim that if you truly embrace God, then He like changes you in some ways, or maybe you cooperate with the Spirit in changing yourself. Different descriptions of it, but that helps you to be that turns you into a different person. It's like, being reborn in Christ kind of thing. And it seems to me that this is actually potentially a testable claim. Not directly, perhaps, but that we might expect. I mean, this is actually slightly different to evils done in the name of religion, but it's connected to the idea of the meager moral fruits kind of response, right? I think they're two sides of the same coin: meager moral fruits and, I don't know, excessive immoral fruits or something. But that you can, of course, claim that, well, look, all of these people who did bad things or didn't live up to what they were supposed to be doing haven't, they didn't truly believe it, or they didn't truly follow it, or that's just what we expect given human agency. But I think look, maybe that's true in a sense, but I want to press the stronger objection that at least many forms of Christianity, as it's been explained to me, make metaphysical claims about the way that God interacts with the world and with human beings. Yeah, I don't want to go on too much about this because we should finish up, but basically that I find these claims inconsistent with what we do observe of the moral behavior of many people claiming to be Christians, or other religions for that matter, or acting in a religious context, or appealing to religious concerns. It seems like we see a lot of bad, and I would say we don't see nearly as much good as I would have expected, given the claims made about the way that God is supposed to be interacting with the world and the light that He's supposed to be bringing to us, as being married to Christ and all that sort of thing. So that's the general thrust of it.
So it would kind of be that the claim that if Christianity were true, then we ought to expect Christians to have acted differently given the New Testament portrait of what happens when you're saved. That
Yes, something
you're
like
indwelt
that.
by the Holy Spirit, and surely that should make a greater impact than what we actually do observe in Christians' lives. Is that kind of,
Yes,
at a certain level, the idea?
that's the argument.
Well, it's one that's bothered me, and I have no profound thoughts to share on it or answers to it.
Fair
And
enough.
so I'll give you that. It's something given that most of my concerns have been about theistic belief generally, and that's been my focus mostly. I haven't thought too hard about issues pertaining to Christianity specifically, because most of the ones that come up when you discuss Christianity are ones that do pertain to theism generally. But this claim about what we ought to expect if Christians really are saved in the way the New Testament describes, I don't know. So for now, I'll give you that, and I'll have to think more about it.
That's a fair response. I always appreciate when people say they don't know rather than just make up nonsense.
Yeah. Well, yeah. James Fodor, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think it's been really substantive, and I'm excited to see what people think of it.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.